The Edmonton Arts Council acknowledges the land on which Edmonton, Amiskwaci, Waskahigan sits, the territory of the Treaty 6 First Nations, and the homeland of the Métis people. We would like to recognize and thank the diverse Indigenous peoples whose ancestors' footsteps have marked this territory for centuries, such as the Nahewa Cree, Dene Sulane, Nakota Sioux, Soto, Nitsitape, Blackfoot, as well as the Métis and Inuit peoples. It is a welcoming place for all people who come together from around the world to share Edmonton as a home. Together, we call upon all of our collective honored traditions and spirits to work in building a great city for today and for future generations. Welcome. We are very lucky this evening to have a trio of distinguished authors as our panel, and it is my great pleasure to introduce Natasha Deen, who will be emceeing the session as well as contributing her own thoughts and ideas. Natasha is an internationally recognized author who writes for kids, for teens, for adults. She does it all. And I'm very pleased to turn it over to you now, Natasha.
Thank you so much. I love that introduction. I think you should just come with me wherever I go and just introduce me that way. Hello and welcome, my friends. I'm so excited to be here with you tonight. And a few years ago, I was out east. I was in Toronto doing some shopping, and I go to the lineup. And there's two women in front of me, and I can't tell if they're in the line or not. And they're elder women, so 70s, 80s, and one is white and one is Caribbean, and she's Guyanese because I can hear it in her accent. And she has a very light accent, so I know she's been here for a very long time, but I'm, listening to them talk and trying to figure out, as a Caribbean kid, when do you jump in and say to your elder, excuse me, can I just get, are you in line? And so I'm not in a real hurry, and I'm loving it because it's not often I get to hear the voice of my culture, and it's sort of like this lullaby, and I'm just riding on these like beautiful memories. And the lady looks over at me, the Caribbean lady looks over, and she goes back to her friend. They're talking about something to do with a condo. She looks over at me again, goes back talking to her friend. The third time she does it, she looks over at me and she says to me, "Hey, pet, we're not in line." And there was three things that happened there in the 1.5 seconds it took for her to say what she said. Her accent deepened. It got rich and really thick. She went from speaking Canadian English to Guyanese Creole, and she called me pet. And in those three things, she told me she saw me. I knew she knew I was a fellow Caribbean kid. And in that moment, I felt so seen and so loved, because it's really rare for people to realize I am Caribbean, And I can't speak to all the motivations that brought you here tonight, but I suspect it's something quite similar to that you are looking to write a character who is outside of your lived experience, and not just, oh, yeah, here's my character and they're not like me at all. You are here because you want guidance, because you want guideposts, because you want to be thoughtful and meticulous in the way that you approach this, so that when your readers slip between the pages of your books and they see this character that you have created on their behalf, they will feel so seen and so represented, and be aware of the love and the care that you have put into creating this character for them and for all the readers. So on behalf of all of your future readers, I thank you for spending this evening with us. And I'm so excited because with us tonight, we have Winnie Yeung and Peter Midgley, and I cannot imagine two more thoughtful people to bring to this conversation. And you will have received your PDF with their bios, but just really quickly, Winnie's debut book, Homes, was her first book. It was shortlisted for the Governor General's Award. It was a CBC Canada Reads. She is currently on leave from her teaching in order to work on her graphic novel and I think a play too, right, Winnie? And Peter Midgley is an editor with decades of experience in fiction, nonfiction, kids literature and poetry. And he's also an author. And I told Peter before we started that just for the heck of it, I was going to tell everybody that in his spare time, he loves playing the bagpipes. To which Peter replied, actually, I do. And I went, well, dang. Now I'm going to have to change this. Folks, Peter Midgley loves to play the harp and he's available for booking. So there you are. There you are. So Peter, since I've sort of put you on the spot there, I'm going to start off with this. You know, when we think of diverse voices, we tend to jump to things like, I'm cisgender, my character isn't. I'm white, my character isn't. But, you know, when we're thinking about diversity and sort of that lived experience and we pull back, that playing field becomes much bigger. You know, I mean, I wrote a story about 1347, Florence, Italy, and the Black Plague, which was well outside of my lived experience. So to you, may I ask the question, when you hear diverse voices or writing outside of our perspective, what do you define that as?
I'm going to say to you, first of all, I'm going to correct you. I did not say I play the bagpipe. I said I can make a squeak up, get a squeak out of it.
That's because I believe in you, man. I believe in you.
So, you have more faith in me than I have. But anyway, diverse voices. I'm going to say that, first of all, I'm going to say that it is, to me, a voice that doesn't draw attention to its diversity. And why I say that is, if you, for instance, try and make a character sound black and you work too consciously at sounding black, you are going to fall into the stereotype traps, especially if you're not part of that culture. So if you are going to do it, so yes, that's probably not the answer that people expect, but that is, I think, a key thing is that but that's with any writing. If you draw attention to the writing, it becomes overwritten, it just feels icky. There's no technical word for that, it's icky. So find your voice of your characters, understand your characters, find a voice that will add to the story, not detract from it. I'd say that's my first thing that I'd say for looking for a diverse voice. Understand the characters, know the characters, don't draw attention to their difference.
That's beautiful. And I believe icky is a scientifically approved term for what you're describing. Absolutely. Yes. Yeah, so Winnie is nodding. And Winnie, can I put it to you then? Using the scientific term icky in your response, can you speak to diverse voices?
Sorry, I just had a little bit of audio troubles right there. Can everyone hear me? Okay, sorry. What does it mean to include diverse voices? Was that the question, Natasha?
Or how do you define diverse voices? Like when you think of that, what is sort of the definition you fall into?
I think it would be more of a celebration of like a multitude of perspectives, but in kind of bringing those voices forward, it's without any expectations of what that voice sounds like, kind of like what Peter was saying. We shouldn't project what we feel like it should sound like. We should actually be open to receiving them exactly how it is. And so it's celebrating multitudes without expectations and without judgment.
That's so beautifully said. YA author Dana Davis is also an actor, and she tells the story of going to an audition, and the director kept saying to her, "You're enunciating. You can't enunciate like that." And and she was thinking to herself, like, "You think Black people can't speak clearly?" Like, but so I think you're right. When we have that, just like if we're too formal or like Peter said, when you're guessing at what they sound, you're trying too hard to sound like it calls terrible attention to itself.
And I'm also, if I can add something here, I'm going to say, pay attention to the paralinguistic features. By that I mean is, I know that when I swap to speaking Afrikaans, or even when I speak isiXhosa or as I best I can now, my entire body language shifts.
Interesting.
So you can do other things, you behave differently, you emote differently, you emphasize differently. So be aware that as you move out of a culture, that those paralinguistic features of language, think, I know, for instance, I read, somebody was telling me that Japanese newsreaders, you'll have somebody saying, because that is a sound in the back that acknowledges that you are being heard. And there are such, every language has these paralinguistic features. Get to know them.
Oh, that's wonderfully said. Winnie, I'm gonna switch back to you. So I was at a book launch for Cathy Casey's new book, Under the Iron Bridge. And in that book, it's 1938 Dusseldorf, and there's 15-year-old Paul Ritter, and he's being pressured to join the Hitler Youth. And Cathy was talking about her research and all the things that she did to make this book authentic. And she made a comment that really stuck with me, because she said something along the lines of, when we get it wrong, there are certain people that will jump on the inaccuracy to invalidate the entire experience. So I have this one detail wrong in my book, therefore the Holocaust never happened. And so I was thinking about that, as writers, when we are going into research and when we're going into background and gaining knowledge. And I wondered, from your perspective, like, what are some of the possible pitfalls for authors when we do go into communities that we are not familiar with, that we don't know?
So I think, as a little bit of a background, so Holmes is my first book, first and only so far, and it is based entirely on the experience of my former ESL student, Abubakar al-Rabia. And so going into everything, I really didn't know anything about his world other than the snippets of news that I would hear, on different channels, right? And so we've mentioned research before. And so when we're looking at research, it is so important to seek out different sources and read lots and lots of nonfiction if you're going to dive into writing about a world that you are unfamiliar with. For example, for me, Syria, it's really important to get that sense. And when it came to putting down dates or writing about events that happen within the Syrian conflict in Abubakar's story, I kind of adopted the journalistic integrity of triple sourcing, or getting 3 separate sources of information to say, yes, this massacre happened on a certain date. Because when we look at things that happen, and when we have things like possibly government apparatus and propaganda involved, what we are trying to, I guess, educate about in our books through the stories that we tell, it can be a little bit tricky to pin down. So I think when we look at it from a certain point of view, which in this situation was a work of creative nonfiction, it was really important to say, okay, although I'm doing a lot of research and checking of sources, this book is not a journalistic work. It is not objective. It is actually very subjective, and it's based entirely on a 15-year-old boy's perception of what was going on in Syria and Iraq and in moving to Canada. So kind of to acknowledge that, this is not a journalistic piece of work was really, really important in that.
No, that's beautifully said. And it kind of, Carol Matis, and I think I'm saying her last name wrong, and I'm really sorry about that. She said something really similar when she was writing Daniel's story. So she did Daniel's story in collaboration with, I wrote it down so I wouldn't get it wrong, the US Holocaust Memorial Museum. So she went and she interviewed like dozens and dozens of Holocaust survivors, and then, sent out the information to the museum. And she said the museum faxed her back somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 pages worth of things that she had been inaccurate or she'd gotten wrong. And she said she pushed back a little bit, because she said, but these are first person accounts. And the museum said, you can't trust memory. because, you know, things will shift and we, you know, as time goes by, and in the retelling, you know, sometimes we change how we remember the story. And so they were going to go back sort of like to what you were saying, the three sources, the different places. And what it made me wonder about was the problem, or the the problematicness of history and news sources, because of course there's always these like implicit biases, or like you said so well, you know, there's propaganda machines. So where do you go, and how do you go? So Peter, can we like sort of push that same question on you, like where are the pitfalls? And, you know, Winnie's best practice was, I think, a really great suggestion, you know, get the multiple sources to make sure that you've got the cooperation. But yeah, yeah. Now I'm thinking collaboration. Right?
Yeah, I think those are the key points. But then I also want to say to you that when you go into it, I mean, I'm doing research right now on a character who is from what was at the time, at the start of colonization, called the Guinea coast, which is everywhere from pretty much Sierra Leone to the Congo. It's this vast expanse. And just going through various accounts to remember that most of the accounts are European accounts of these journeys, and then to go back into records, to go to oral historians and to find out what the other versions of that story are, and slowly to piece together something. So yes, do not dismiss oral accounts, for instance, as that they can be remarkably accurate. Yes, memory is fickle, we know that. But I also think that if you're going into any kind of community, beware of going in and trying to inadvertently replicate the power structures and that exist at the moment and assume the dominance of, say, a Western worldview. You cannot make those assumptions. Do not have a willingness to reconsider your own views and your own preconceptions. If you don't, that's a huge problem. Listen carefully. Again, listen. When I was editing Jalal Barzanji's book, Man in Blue Pajamas with Kurdistan, it took me right at the end when suddenly Jalal drew a map. And he said to me, this city is to the north of Erbil. But he drew the city to the east. And I went, wait. And then I realized the cartographic center for Muslims is Mecca. Not north, as it would be in a Western worldview, which means that every single direction in that book that I had made the assumption up to that point had to be shifted by 90 degrees to get it into the right worldview.
Oh, wow. That's amazing. That's such a great, that's a great example.
So yes, do not assume that people are going to talk from that worldview. So, and don't assume, I'll say this over and over, don't assume that when you finished a book that your relationship with that community or with that experience ends. It does not.
Yeah, and I think, and I'm not sure if we had it in the PDF, but I think we'd also talked about during our, like in our email exchanges about reading, and Winnie, that might have been you, right? Where you were talking about reading the poetry, reading the works of that specific culture, because you're absolutely right, Peter. Like how we tell a story in the Western world is not necessarily how other cultures tell stories. And I remember one friend saying in his culture, you set aside the whole day if someone's going to tell you a story, because it's not going to be linear, right? They're going to take you, and the whole idea is that you're sitting around and you're eating, so it's like this whole communal thing. So are there other kind of like best practices if we're getting our sources, if we're going to those cultural sources, if we're getting multiple sources, is there anything else?
I think, Natasha, it's so important to as writers ourselves to recognize our own blind spots, right? And, you know, when you go into it as, let's say, as a learner and go, I want to learn everything I can about this character that I'm going to create, and I'm going to read a lot of nonfiction, and then, like I mentioned in our previous talk, to read, if you're writing about Syria, to read Syrian poets and read Syrian authors, so that you can not only get, you know, the factual side, but when we read other artists, we get the feel and flavor of their voice, which I think a really important skill, especially if we're going to write from another's perspective, is when you're doing that interviewing process, we have to be really, really great observers. And I think Peter mentioned this earlier, when you're writing about a different language, we all have different hesitators, and we all have different little, I guess, linguistic quirks that we have culturally, that, you know, I may make as a, you know, Chinese person, but I don't realize I do them. And when we are interviewing and wanting to write from a different perspective, it's really important to spend a lot of time observing, listening, and, you know, even just in the way that a person holds himself when they're talking about a certain person, you'll notice something about, let's say, the cultural hierarchy that is really important to their worldview. But I think another pitfall that we have to be aware of, and we've talked about it a little bit, is just how memory is so fallible, right? It comes to mind, one time I was talking to Abubakar and his family, including an uncle and a cousin, about this one particular big event that happened when one of the uncles was taken and arrested in the middle of the night. And it was so interesting because Abubakar and half his family remembered it one way, and the other half of the family, including uncle, remembered it completely differently. Even though they're all physically there, we can't forget that what our brain very naturally does to protect ourselves from traumatic experiences is it will block the memory. And so when you're entering that journey of interviewing someone, I would just say that we have to be very sensitive of the journey that we're going to take that person that you're interviewing on, that what they're going to come into, they might struggle to remember, and as they're struggling to remember, might trigger other memories that can be very harmful in some ways. So that's a potential pitfall to be aware of.
Yeah, and you know, and I was thinking too, when you were talking about like language and how we hold our bodies, even within words that we think are universally understood to mean like one thing or another. So in Caribbean culture, being called girl is not an insult, right? It's usually that someone's irritated with you. Hey, girl, right? They're so annoyed that you lose your name. You're just gonna, you know, or you know, so. And then sometimes too, like in tone, it's a love word, and I always have to like remind myself within North American culture though that it's considered kind of a derogatory term when you're talking to like another woman, unless those are your friends, and then you can be like, hey girl, you know what I mean? So even things that we think we know and we understand can shift. And change, and like within communities, like within cultures, and then within like specific communities. I remember being on one of the indigenous reservations, and I was doing a school visit, and the principal was there with, you know, all the kids. And when he was leaving, you know, he's at the back of the auditorium and he's yelling back at me, right? And he goes, oh yeah, that was great, we loved it, right? And all the kids are like, oh yeah, ha ha ha. And then as he walks out the door, he goes, yeah, girl, we love you. And the whole room stopped. And I could tell in the way they turned and looked at me, I just been given a super great compliment that he did not call just any, like that was a love word. And that was a love term within that very, you know, so, and I think, Peter, that actually goes back to something you might've been talking about in terms of like, how much time are you willing to spend with that community? Like, it can't just be, oh, I went on vacation for the 2 weeks and this was really fun and I'm going to come back and I'm going to write about like the Bahamas from a tourist perspective. It's like, no, you got to come in and you've got to live with us on the ground floor day to day.
Yes, and if you are going to write about your 2-week experience in the Bahamas, then by all means do it, but then you are going to be having to do a heck of a lot more homework after the fact and go back perhaps to revisit and get that experience. So yes, you've got to do that. And I will also say is that know that the communities you go into don't owe you anything. You are their guest. You are their visitor. If you go into somebody else's house as a guest, you don't assume familiarity off the bat, not until they are very good friends of yours. You pay your respects to the host. You show your deference in way to the way they do things. If they say, take your shoes off, then you take your shoes off, even though that may not be your culture. You offer assistance and you help, but if they say no, then you listen. So don't assume you belong there. Be flexible, be open, and know that you are the guest.
Yeah,
So,
that's really, sorry, go ahead.
no,
And I think, Peter, that just makes me think about the vulnerability, right? I mean, I think when you're a writer, you have to get used to a certain amount of vulnerability because it's so scary sending your work out there. You're like, my little baby is for everyone to judge. But it's also really important to admit that you are a guest and that this is not my story just because I went to visit this place and I'm writing about it. And this is not my story just because I did research and I spent a lot of time with this family. I think it's really important to openly acknowledge and openly talk about, listen, this is not my story that I'm writing. This is through my lens, right? So even with the Boubacar story, I talk about that all the time. It's not actually his story as per se, because in my picking and choosing the events that I've related, it's through my lens. And so as writers, we have to acknowledge that that is a potential vulnerability that people might go, well, I might discount your narrative because it's not your story. But if we openly acknowledge that it is through my lens and I'm learning and I'm there as a guest to honor and to learn about that, it's okay to be very, very open about what you don't know and what you're learning about.
No, that's well said. Go ahead, Peter, sorry.
No, vulnerability is so important. Of course it is for you. It shouldn't deter you, but you need to understand that this is deeply emotional work when you enter another culture. You are in some ways setting your own culture aside and moving into something that is not necessarily unknown, but often unfamiliar. This is being in a strange place. It is difficult territory.
Well, and I think
look after yourself.
Yeah, and I think that that vulnerability and that and within the vulnerability, there needs to be a willingness for us to not get defensive when we realize we've been holding on to like wrong mindsets, if that makes sense. So in the PDF, there's a link to Stella Young's amazing TED Talk where she says, "I'm not your inspiration, thank you very much." And I was thinking about that within communities where people identify either as differently abled or disabled, and even within like terminology, right? That's where we need to do the work, because some people want like person first language. I am a person with a disability. Other people want it to just be like, I'm disabled. And we have to know, especially if we're going to be creating those characters, where does that go? I know within the deaf community, it's the same thing. There's discussion over, am I a person who is deaf or with deafness, hard of hearing, or am I just identify as deaf, right? And I was thinking about that idea of like the way that many of us grew up with this idea of like people who were differently abled, disabled, and how inspirational it was. And I really loved Stella's talk where she was like, no, we don't exist to make you feel better about your life, and she tells this really funny story about, some of the members of the town wanting to give her an award when she was like 13 or 14. And the parents were like, great, except she hasn't done anything. And what she talks about is like the idea that somehow the fact that she exists should somehow be given an award, and how like actually kind of insulting that is, because it sets a bar that just says, we don't think you're really capable. And I think when we go into, it's not just like our cultural biases, but also acknowledging that, you know, as we were growing as children, we were taught philosophies and ways of thinking that don't do us any good and don't do the people around us any good. And it's okay to set those things down and still love the people who taught us those things, right? Because sometimes I see, it was in regards to teaching critical race theory and like the indigenous history through the indigenous lens in the schools. And it was a parent who was really upset about it all. And then when I was really listening to her, what I realized was that what she was really upset about was that her daughter had come home crying and said to her, how did you let this happen? Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you stop it? And the mom had nowhere to go because nobody told her that this was going on, and no one acknowledged, right? Thanksgiving is great. There we are. We're all sharing and we're a big happy family. And let's just, you know, not talk about, you know, all the horrors that were going on. So I think with like that vulnerability comes the willingness to learn, the willingness to admit we were wrong, the willingness to admit the people who came before us and taught us and loved us were also wrong. And it is okay to let those things go. I'm going to move to the next question, but as I'm moving to sort of the last question, Winnie, Peter, and I had sort of agreed that we were going to blitz through the questions I was going to ask, because we thought it would be much more helpful and of far more value if you could ask questions that were specific to your work, specific to what you were looking to do. So please feel free to put your questions in the chat box, or when the time comes, if you go to, if you go to participants and click on your name, I think you should be able to like put your hand up. And it should be somewhere in the bottom as well. I'm looking for it and I'm not seeing it. But yeah, so either throw your questions up in the chat or unmute yourself if you're comfortable doing so and asking us that questions. Oh, there we go. If we go to reactions, that's wonderful. Thanks, Cassandra. So in regards to the last question, I have kind of an anecdote that I want to ask about, sort of introduce by way of asking this question. And it is a potentially triggering anecdote. So because it's about pedophilia. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to hold my fingers up when I'm doing the anecdote. If this is something that you are just like, thank you, don't need to hear this, and you know, please feel free to hit your mute button. When I'm done, I'm going to put my fingers down and I'll go into the question, at which point, you know, by all means, raise the volume back. So W, go ahead and mute if you need to. Okay, so I don't know if anyone was following the controversy surrounding Dr. Alan Walker and their book, Long Dark Shadow, Minor Attracted People and the Pursuit of Dignity. But Dr. Walker releases this book, 15,000 people sign a petition saying this person needs to be fired. Dr. Walker then resigned from their job. But it kind of leads me, it leads me into this question about when we talk about, as writers, we should be free to write anything. We should be able to go into any sort of territory. That story, that scandal, sort of prompts me to ask about, are there some stories we shouldn't be writing? Are there some identities that we shouldn't be voicing right now because it is up to those people within those cultures to tell their story first, and we need to sit down and wait a minute? Are there, you know, and sort of like, now there's 3 questions there, but are there like in that mix, are there sort of like worst practices and things that, you know, we should just not ever even think about doing? And Winnie, with that big giant question, can I throw it to you to sort of like wade in to, are there some things we shouldn't be writing about? Are there some identities we shouldn't be trying to like create, because we're not part of those communities, worst practices?
I mean, it just seems like such an obvious thing, but I don't know if I'm willing to name a thing that we shouldn't write about. I think we should not write about things that we do not have permission to. So, and I guess it depends what kind of writing you're doing, right? If you're basing an entire character on a person's story, we don't write that story unless we have their permission, their participation, in many different ways. That just seems like the only thing that I can really live by, because if I was only restricted to telling Chinese stories, because that is what I am, I would not be a very good Chinese writer, because I, grew up in Edmonton.
Yes. I feel that, but the reason I asked the question is because, and I wish I could remember the author and the title of the book, but she wrote a book that was based off of an Indigenous story, and the community came after the book was published and said, you had no right to tell this story. And she said, but I went to the elders and I asked permission. And they said, the story does not belong to the elders. The story belongs to the community. You did not ask the community. They don't speak for us. It's not like like that type of a hierarchy. And so they ended up, pulling the book. And like I said, I can't remember her name, or else I would, tell you. But yeah, so like when we are talking about those things, and I agree with you, if we're only allowed to ever write the things that we're living, there goes every kid's book, every contemporary young reader, middle grade YA, because we are none of us a 16-year-old kid living in 2021. We all grew up at different times. So unless we're all going to write historical fiction, which horrifically is getting close to 2010, we're kind of out of luck here. So, Peter, what do you think?
Well, I would say the opposite of everything we've been saying up to this point counts as bad practice. So just go back and look at that. But I would say one of the worst things you can do for me is to add diversity to a story because you feel that is what is required to be politically correct or whatever. If not all stories, I believe not all stories have to include diversity. If the story doesn't call for it, if the story doesn't need it, don't put it in just because. And yet, so many people do feel the need to put it in. Diversity needs to be integral to the story. It should be adding to the story. It should be doing something. The other thing is that also to be careful not to include diversity because you want to teach. You're not always in that. It's not your job to do the teaching. That just, no. And the last worst practice is to, I think, use family and close friends as either sensitivity readers or just plain readers for your fiction. It's just not a good idea. It's very hard for friends and family to tell you what you are not doing right.
Yes. It's interesting because that diversity push goes both ways, because on more than one occasion, I've talked to an author who is like a person of color who was offered a contract, but could they just please do this, this, and this with this diverse character? And the author's like, no, it has nothing to do with the story, but and it's like, oh, Natasha, we love your book, but could she wear a sari and could she eat like curry with her fingers? And you're like, no, it has nothing to do, and I know authors who turn down contracts because they went, well, this is wildly insulting, because it makes all these like weird assumptions about what the culture is and who are we speaking to. And I think that's something, when we're talking about like own voices and diversity, it's like, and Peter, you hit the nail on the head. Who are we talking to, right? And I know, again, for people who are in part of like marginalized communities, there's sort of like all of these questions, right? About, you know, am I, you know, and oh, I wish I could remember. Shoot, it was an author who was talking, and she made the comment, because she's South Asian, and she said, if I put in this thing and then explain it, because she was talking about wanting to write characters of color that her daughter could look at and go, I see myself, right? And she said, but you know, the moment I explain what this thing is, I've now said to my daughter, this book isn't for you, because my daughter knows what this is, right? And I thought about that, and I thought about like within YA and with middle grade too, that, you know, more and more what we see is characters who will speak in a different language or who will do something. And the assumption, you know, like for the reader is like, Google it, right? Or catch what is going on via how these characters are reacting to each other, but no one is going to translate this for you because it now pulls us out of the characters, because the characters, you know, it's like Jurassic Park when they're like, well, as you know, and there's two scientists talking to each other, and you're like, yeah, of course they know, they're scientists. That's such an awkward way for screenwriters to be like, hey, audience, like here, this is actually for you, wink, you know, like we know. So
yeah, you know, I'm going to say that if you are writing, for instance, using a word and you're going to say somebody doesn't understand, I think that any word that you bring in should be, you don't have to go and say, teaching moment, I'm going to explain what this is, but it should be very clear from the context what a word means, so that even though you don't know the culture, you should be, your prose beforehand should be offering that context.
mm-hmm.
So you need to, again, it comes down to understand the community, know the community, to be able to translate and to convey, sorry, not translate, but to convey that information.
Yeah, that's really well said. Winnie, you looked like you were going to say something.
I was just gonna say, you know, along the lines of what Peter was saying before, tokenism is harmful. So don't just add a character with a splash of this because you think it's going to appeal to the crowd these days, because I feel like that's even more harmful than not doing it.
Yeah, that's really well said. And I just want to share, I'm gonna sit here and hope that my screen pulls this up. Okay, perfect. I want to share a couple of things just to what Peter was saying in terms of like not throwing in diversity for diversity's sake. So when we look at diversity in children's books, so this is in 2018, what we see is that 50% of the books feature white characters. 1%, for example, features First Nations. And if you add up the First Nations, Latinx, Asian Pacific, African American, they are still a smaller percentage than the animals. So stories featuring animals is higher. And the other one that I want to share, because it speaks both to like why we need diversity, but also what I'm going to say here. So this one here, so this is about children's books that are either about marginalized people, right? And what we're seeing is that, or what I want to say is this: if you are part of a community that has always been beloved by publishers and has always had a home with publishers, I don't think you need to worry that that won't be the case anymore. You know, as an able-bodied person, I know that there's always going to be room for characters who are able-bodied. I don't need to do something with my character to cater or to, like Winnie so beautifully said, like that tokenism that ends up being so much more harmful because I'm trying to do something that's not authentic to the story, that's not authentic to the characters. So, you know, like keep that up. A good story is always going to be a good story, right? And so, you know, if it's part and parcel to the story, then yes. But if not, then I think that we can use the same rule that the doctors do, right? First, do no harm. So on that note, I want to open it up to questions, unless Peter, Winnie, did you have anything that you wanted to sort of say before we open up for questions?
No, I think we've covered most of the territory. Let's go into, we could carry on talking forever on this topic, but let's get to some of the questions.
Wonderful. Susie, I see you have your hand up. Can you tell us how you found your hand? Because I saw in the chat you said you didn't have a hand.
No, I didn't, but I saw reactions. So I was just a little bit late on that.
If you haven't got a full screen open, you may see a button with 3 dots that says more. If you click on that, you will see one of the boxes is reactions.
Yes, exactly. So my question or my remark was, with a question attached to it, I think that the current climate is one in which white people perhaps should, for the time being, hold off on including diverse characters because it will be seen as a kind of atonement or something. And but the world is diverse, and so when you're writing about the world around you, it is incredibly diverse. So whenever and my life is very different, so when I'm writing, I don't, but if the character is from another culture, do you say that, or do you just let it go? I mean, do I say Shelley, who's African American, or a Black woman? Like, yeah. Would you say that? I don't think I would say that.
Well, I'm going to say that I think so. I've got so many questions down to your questions, but what I was wondering, Susie, when you said you don't want to write diverse characters because you feel like it's not like the right space or the right time, do you mean writing a diverse character where the story is centering around?
No, I would never do that. Obviously, that's not my experience. But if the classic, of course, is the the best friend character or something. I'm using stereotypes.
Yes.
But do you say that this person is Asian American, or that's probably not a great idea right now.
I don't know.
I just think I've done it in past work.
I think I'm curious.
Now I'm horrified.
No, because we learn and we do better, right? I mean,
all those books off the shelf.
Well, I am curious because I heard a story about a white writer who in like speculative fiction, so full on fantasy, another world, the whole bit, and had diversity within her characters. And this was like around 2016, 2017, just right when that whole push came for like own voices and that sort of thing. And the publisher got quite worried and said, hey, listen, we think as a white writer with you writing these different characters of color, there might be pushback and we don't want to see that. So can you please just make them all white? And she said, I could, but then I feel like that's going to be sending a whole other message that I'm not intending.
Really bad one.
Yeah. So what she did was she went back, and if anyone's ever gotten to the point of copy edits, the sheer amount of work now she's now going through. She had to basically go back. She went back and she rewrote everything. So there's never a description of her characters because she thought because she said, I just can't, because that's not the world I painted. But on the other side, I'm trying to like respect what my publisher's saying. So she went and she did this. And then all the reviews that came back and she got hammered because readers said, we can't, there's no indication on what these characters look like. We have no idea, we're floundering. So here's this, poor author who is trying to manage different expectations and thinking she's found the answer, which is, I'm just not going to describe anyone. I'll let their personalities speak for them, and then gets, pilloried by critics and reviewers for doing it. So Peter, Winnie, what do you think?
I think that this is a minefield, and if you ask 100 people, you'll get 110 opinions on what to do with this particular one. But I sense that where if it is relevant to name an identity, then you should. If it is not relevant, then you don't necessarily need to. You can also reveal identity with many other clues, cultural clues that come around there that would enrich the story. So I don't know that you shouldn't, to answer Susie's question, I don't know that we should stop writing, but the question is not to, the problem is not to stop writing, but to write with greater sensitivity and with greater insight. In other words, white folks, go do your homework.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right.
Paul Kocha said it really well. He's a YA author, and he said, when it comes to writing any character that's outside of your experience, if you're not willing to do the homework, don't write the character. Yeah. And I thought that was beautifully said. Winnie, I see you nodding.
Yes, because, you know, I think it comes down to whoever you're writing about, it should be done with respect and sensitivity. Exactly. And if you do it with that respect and sensitivity, it will show through that you're not just writing about this person and making it this way or this representative just for the sake of, right? So I don't feel like we should say, oh, I shouldn't write about this person, because, you know, here's something really interesting that was outright said to me at the very beginning. I wrote someone else's story, of which I'm clearly not that religion, that culture. I am not a Syrian Muslim boy. Pretty obvious, right? I wrote someone else's story. And here's the thing. A publisher said to me, well, because you're not white male, you'll be okay. You won't be lambasted for it.
Wow.
And, no.
I'm so cringing for you.
Oh my God. Oh my God.
It was absolutely horrible. I mean, to a certain extent, I could understand, because, like, you know, there is a certain brutality and overcorrection in some ways in the current culture that we live in. But I do not accept that a white male writer could not deal with someone else's story with equal sensitivity and love and respect, and shining that light on that. But
seriously, they've been doing it since the dawn of time.
Sorry?
They've been doing it forever.
Yeah. I just want to answer another question here from Gillian O'Reilly to say about Canadian stats. In Canada, we don't collect data in the same kind of way with those kind of racialized groupings that the US does. So it's very difficult to extract these kind of statistics and ratios within a Canadian publishing environment, because we simply do not collect those stats.
Yeah.
For better or for worse, that's a separate discussion.
The other thing to think about, and I'm seeing it in the chat, so Leslie, Lorna, and Karen, thank you, because they're making a really good point. Within writing for kids, it's very important to have representation and diversity, because the whole, like, a giant part of childhood is your identity. And, you know, I think all of us at some point in time have read a book that didn't include anybody like us. And I mean, that was a growing up thing, right? Unless I wanted to read a slave story. And there's really, quite frankly, there's only so many slave stories I can stomach. But yeah, you know, so that's another thing to consider, Susie, is who is your audience? Because depending on your audience, it's going to be quite important. Robert, can we move to your question? Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for your presentation. I'm really enjoying it from all three of the writers and speakers. I have a couple of questions. I'm currently writing a novel about Southern Africa, which is where I lived in the 1970s. And I lived in a country that was Black ruled. It was an independent country that had been colonized by the British, but it became independent in 1964. So it was a fairly new nation. And I was writing about my personal experiences in that country, some of the issues about racism that I saw and I encountered, and the lingering things of colonialism and apartheid that was going on there. The thing that I realized when I was living there was that there was a lot of similar things that were happening in Canada against Indigenous people. And I wanted to write that part into my book now. Like I've been working towards that but in the 1970s, a lot of Canadians were not aware of what had happened in Canada with Indigenous people. I mean, I was aware because I have Indigenous ancestry, and I also have members of my family that supported the residential schools. Like I was from a church that ran residential schools. And so I was aware of that this was happening, but it was still, so it was an awareness that I was getting, and I was trying to write it into my book. But I don't know if I'm writing in today's lens. I originally wrote the novel back in the 1980s. Okay, and then I am now looking back at it as an older person, and also as somebody who has read and interacted with Indigenous people a lot more, and also has been to Africa again and seen and heard about things more modern. And so I'm just wondering whether I should be putting a present kind of lens on those experiences, or just write them as they were back in those days.
Peter, this feels like an editor's question.
I
Sorry,
think
Robert,
yeah.
Robert,
Sorry.
can you just clarify? Can you clarify for us? Is it a nonfiction or a fictional book?
Fiction.
Okay.
But I mean, it's generally fiction. Like the characters in the book they're not my family per se. They're not people I knew per se. They're just people that were maybe similar to what happened. There are some historic characters mentioned, like the president of Zambia, which was the country I lived in. And I do mention some of the world leaders of that time. There would have been Prime Minister Vorster from South Africa. There would have been Ian Smith from Rhodesia.
Okay.
But I don't talk about.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Peter, go ahead.
I think in cases when you are writing relatively recent, and I use the word relatively recent, historical fiction that is beyond your culture, and especially very complex and difficult cultures like Southern Africa, is to, again, make sure that you understand the nuances of the society. Be careful that in trying to be authentic to the period, that you don't replicate the racism of that period. You can indicate it without replicating it. You know, the first thing in disaster control, when they teach you about disaster control, is do not replicate the disaster.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and that's simply to say that, how did you cut your finger off? Oh, he took the knife and he did that. You know, you don't replicate the disaster. And the same happens in fiction. So when you enter those kind of territories, first of all, make sure that you've, again, read multiple sources so that you get all sides of that story. If you're going to use highly difficult characters, John Foster was it's hard to write about him without getting emotional. But it's also hard to write about that without understanding the contexts there. This is a case where I would tread very, very carefully and understand that his connection to Zambia is a very different one to what, say, to the immediately post-independence government. Understand what's happening in the rest of Africa to the north of this. Leaders in Zambia, in the newly independent Zambia, are not walking into a void. They are walking into the language of Leopold Senghor. They are working into this language of a Pan-Africanist vision from the Jomo Kenyattas, from that. They're not working in a void. Understand where they are coming from as well.
Okay.
Yeah, it's beautifully said. Winnie, any extra thoughts there? No, well said. Okay. Okay, thank you very much, Robert. I appreciate we appreciate the questions because it helps to give more specific answers and to be of better service in the panel. So Heather,
Can I ask one other question, or before I move off?
Sure.
Okay, like I also wrote it's a biographical sketch of my grandparents. They lived in Edmonton in about 1905 through to about 1918. And my grandmother at that time was a school teacher with the Edmonton Public Schools. And she taught during a different era than is now, okay? In that time, like Canada, even though it was an independent country, it was considered a British, in some ways a British colony still in the early 1900s. And it reflected in the education system, like they talked about the British Empire and glory and the being citizens of the British Empire and important to remember the King's birthday and this kind of thing in the school system. And my grandmother was the only teacher in her school. Like it was during the war, she basically had to teach kids all ages, so it was a tough time being a teacher. But I wrote this biography for the 200th anniversary of the city of Edmonton in 1994 originally. And I was trying to get it into a collection, an anthology that the city was putting together. And I got in trouble with the editors of that publication. They kept coming back to me and saying, you've got to include all this other historical stuff about how different racial groups were treated, and you have to bring in how the British kind of suppressed other people that came to Canada, how they were resident enemies. And by the end of that, rewriting it, because I also interviewed my grandparents. I mean, I got their stories, and that's what I wanted to focus on. They passed away. My grandmother passed away in 1970. So I was a very young guy, like maybe 12 years old when I talked to her and got her story about what it was like for her to be a teacher in Beverly and in Edmonton. And then my grandfather was with the Edmonton Police Service. He was a policeman and then he became a detective. But I talked to both of them, and their own personal stories got buried by all this other stuff that I had to write in, and I had to do a lot more research and find out what citizenship making really meant. And so I'm just wondering, do people that edit and publish books have the right to do that to authors? And then at the end of the day, they didn't even take my document. Like, I was able to present it publicly at the seminars and that, and I got a lot of support especially from teachers in the Edmonton Public Schools that had attended it, because they knew I was going to talk about that, and they were quite appreciative. But the book, I don't even know what it is now.
Robert, I'm gonna jump in to answer that question because the short answer is yes. If you're looking to be traditionally published, that publisher has a market, they have an audience that they are looking at, they have readers that they know their readership. And so if you're going to be traditionally published, it's going to go from your project to a collaborative project. There's going to be editors, there's going to be proofreaders, there's going to be all kinds of things. And there's a difference because when you're writing the story, at least, and this is my opinion, so take it with a grain of salt, right? If you're writing the story that is very, very centered on your grandparents, very centered on your family, the people who will automatically connect to that are members of your family. If you're looking for a broader audience, that's what the publisher is there for. So yes, they can ask you to make all kinds of rewrites. Yes, they can, ask you for revisions upon revisions and still not give you a contract. And that's where the beauty of self-publishing comes in, because then, if you want to still write that story that is centered around the family, that's where that can be. But it's also a really good, and I thank you for the question, because this is where it's very important for writers to really do our homework, not just with the story, but then who is the publisher we're going to look to? Who are we going to submit to? And there's a lot of publishers that, listen, right now, the worry is okay, if I'm not part of a marginalized community, I'm writing a story about a marginalized community, is that going to be an automatic rejection? And a lot of publishers will tell you, no, it's not an automatic rejection, but there probably will be a conversation about, why are you the person to write this story? What are you bringing to the story? How did you work with this community? They're going to be checking the authenticity of voice. So those are some things that to consider. Peter, Winnie, can I toss it to either one of you?
Having been in the traditional publishing industry, I will say yes, you can do that, but you should also always bear in mind as an editor, and I'm speaking here as a freelance copy editor, to pay attention to the author's story and to the author's voice. So it is absolutely a collaboration, and a collaboration means hearing all sides of the story. And if it doesn't work, then an editor's job is to say, sorry, we cannot make this step. There are certain calls that you simply cannot do because of any number of things. So yes, you have a right to make that call, but as an editor, you also need to be very aware of whose story you are working with. Every time as an editor, you enter into a story to start editing it, you have to be aware of who the author is.
Yeah. Winnie, can I kick it over to you to add in?
Something new to contribute to what you and Peter both said. I agree.
Can I also bring the attention to the chat box? And Vina, I hope I'm saying your name right. Thank you, because as we were having the panel discussion, I was trying to think Matthew's book. Craft in the Real World is a really, really great writing resource for authors. So thank you for reading my mind and throwing that up there. I appreciate it. Heather, Heather Morrow, please, your question. We'd love to hear it.
Turn my mic on first. Hi. So I'm a playwright, and I've had some really good luck recently. I've been working on a play that's gotten some phenomenal feedback. It's about a threesome, essentially. So it was a straight cis woman, bisexual man, and a gay man. And yeah, like I said, I've gotten fantastic feedback. I did have one person say that they loved the story and they were a little concerned that many theaters simply would not be able to do it because of the story. And I was kind of taken aback by that. And essentially, I guess I'm worried, like you kind of answered this question already. Like you mentioned that some authors end up turning down contracts because they're asked to do things which they're just, no, that's not the way it is. And I'm a little bit concerned that, like, I put the work into interviewing people who are in polyamorous relationships. And I've had people read it who really liked it. And I've also had someone who's much more successful than me saying, does it need as much sex in it? And I'm like,
Yes, it does.
yes.
Right, because you wrote it that way, right?
Yeah. So I guess I am very, very, very committed to this story. Like, this is something that I am really, really proud of, and I want it to thrive. I've done a lot of self-producing in the past because, again, like people have said that my writing is really good and it just didn't go anywhere. So it's like, I don't want this play to die, so I produced it. But I don't want to do that with this play because it will need more money and it basically needs more than just I can give it. Like, and I think this story deserves more. But if it gets to the point where no one will do it as is, and like, yes, even with collaborating with actors, with finding directors like who are interested in it, but if they ask for changes that I'm really, really not comfortable with, is there a point where you just say, I would rather this story not happen than have it done wrong?
Winnie, can you take that for us? Can you start us off?
I just, that's so difficult because I think, you know, we come from a place where we love our art, we love our little creations so much. And I don't know if, you know, because like the other thing is you have to be, you know, realistic, and you have to go, I have to earn a living somehow. And I just don't know how we can factor in commercial feasibility, or is it going to be produced? Is it going to be published? Is it going to be accepted into the art that we create? So if you love what you're writing and you believe in what you're writing, then keep on doing that, because hopefully there will be a theater out there that feels as strongly of your work as you do. And I just don't think that we can write towards this idea of, you know, it'll be a commercial success or it'll be picked up somewhere.
Well, and I don't know enough about the theater to say this one way or another, but what I'm wondering is, like, if it comes to the point where you think, no, I just don't want it to be like that, because then I've lost my sense of pride in ownership and creation. Is it possible within the theater community, if you move on to another play and that one gets produced, can you come back to this one? Because like in writing, we talk about trunk novels, right? And then once you are established, you can go back to the more risky stuff, or the stuff that people were like, because now you have a name and you have a following of some kind. And people are more willing to sort of roll the dice on things that might be a little less on the bell curve. So is that a possibility within theater, Peter, Winnie? Do we know?
I am so new to this. I'm new to all of it. I don't know. But I also know that from the very little bit that I know about theater contracts, playwriting, rights, and all that kind of stuff, the theater will have read the whole thing, and I would hope that it's a dialogue. They would say to you before they sign you on to agree to produce the play, if we were to workshop and make these changes, where are you at it, right? Because that is kind of respect to the playwright, the collaboration, right? So I would imagine that it's a conversation. I would, in my very naive way, hope that it's a conversation.
Peter, what do you think?
I don't know the Canadian theatre world enough to really comment on that, but I will say this, that if playwrights had compromised what they had wanted to say and compromised their ethics in order to get produced, we would not have a Heiner Miller from East Germany, for instance. We would not have an Athol Fugard or Mbogeni Ngema or John Carney from South Africa. Because their plays were asked to be compromised. They asked Fugard to perform plays to racially segregated audiences. He refused, etc., etc. So there are certain boundary lines that you have to draw. And some of the greatest playwrights we have around are ones who have made those kind of strong moral stances.
Yeah, and I think it's like, again, it's your career, Heather, right? And you're the one who knows where you want to go and
Yeah.
what you want to accomplish. But I feel like it is okay to walk away from something that doesn't feel right to you.
Yeah.
And probably it's better to walk away from something that doesn't feel right than to go into something having a lot of reservations. Because if you, like, at least from my perspective, I feel like if I held on to that play, I could always come back to it. But once I relinquish it to this person and now it gets changed, it will never be mine again, right? And I have to sort of figure out, is it better, am I happier to wait the extra 2 years it'll take to get someone else to produce my work, or is this just now where I just jump in? And I think, at the end of the day, that's something that really only you're going to be able to answer, depending on the kinds of things that they're asking you for, right? Because there might be a theater out there that goes, no, we love this, we love everything that you're saying about this, and come with us, let us run to, you know what I mean? So yeah.
Thank you so much. That was great.
Yeah, you're welcome. Diane, I hope I'm saying that
Hi.
right? Diane,
Yes.
yeah.
Well, thank you for this presentation. It has been very informative and excellent. And my question is about sort of getting permission. And then I'm reading Jillian's response in the chat there. And I'm hoping I'm not doing what she's talking about. I fell in love with Tuktoyaktuk when I was in grade 2 and had a presentation in my school. And so it's always been, something I'm interested in, and it's finding its way into my stories. And so I've written a picture book that has Tuktoyaktuk as the setting and included some words some of the vocabulary that they use. And I've touched base with the community and an elder, but I was very surprised today to hear that if you get permission from the elder, that really doesn't necessarily mean you have permission.
Just in her case, right?
Okay.
That was just a something that I had seen, and like you, I went, oh, I thought, but in that specific case, the community said the story doesn't belong to the elder, it belonged to everybody, so they couldn't give permission. So sorry for the interruption, but yeah, go ahead.
That's okay. So yes, so I'm just wondering if there's any advice on getting permission, and how many people would you talk to and in the community and elders?
It's a good question. And I don't know. See, for me, I'm the same way. I would have thought that if I went to the elders, that the elders are speaking on behalf of their community. So I was very surprised when I saw that author, they ended up, I think, pulling her book. If someone knows what I'm talking about, then please fact check me, because I think that's what happened. They pulled her book. But Winnie, Peter, what do you think?
No way to talk to every single elder and every single person in the community to obtain permission. And again, I think if you approached it with that respect, with that work in honoring, we're never going to get everyone's permission,
Mm-hmm. Yes, there's some really interesting remarks in the chat. So Trudy says, I have heard and read that the whole Indigenous community needs to agree, no hierarchy. If one person objects, then it can't happen. And Cassandra adds in and says, I wonder if there's a difference between the whole story versus some of the language. Some things are more sacred, is my understanding. And then Trudy added in that communities do hold meetings about the project. So maybe that's an option, is if there's a meeting. Peter, what do you think?
Again, understand. I think the key here is to understand the protocols within a community and ask who should be doing it. Should you be asking the elders? Do the elders speak for the community? Do you need to go to a community meeting? I think it's not. It's about making sure that you understand the protocols and that you follow the correct protocols.
Okay.
Thank you.
So, yeah, that's really good advice on both your parts. Thanks,
Usually,
Diane.
correct me if I'm wrong, but don't editors and even the board of directors of the publishing company that decides to bring on that story, they're going to have their opinions on how to best address those issues as well. When it is a story and you are telling someone else's story, they definitely have their ways of addressing that.
Okay, so there's the three options, right? Verify that you've done the right process in getting the permission, look at the community boards, and then the check with the publisher to see what they also have. So that's great. That's great. Thank you. Thank you, friends. Thanks, Diane. Jenna, what is your question?
Hi, thank you so much for hosting this event, but I'll be quick with my question. I'm working on a middle grade novel, and it takes, yeah.
Sorry, can you say that again? You cut out there a little.
Oh, sure, I'll turn off my camera. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm writing a middle grade novel that takes place in Saskatchewan at a Bible camp. Novel follows a young girl who is non-religious and learning time, and along with learning ghost stories and not knowing the difference between a story from the Bible and camp lore, and these camps, having grown up in rural Saskatchewan, they often attract kids who aren't religious because most of the camps are Bible camps. There's a lack of, I guess, diversity there. But one of my main characters, she is an Indigenous character, and having grown up in that area, I many Cree kids, and I do think she is integral to the story. And also, I'm rambling a little bit, but a lot of the story is encountering other characters, different beliefs. For instance, one girl is quite religious, she's very Christian. Another is a self-proclaimed witch. And so I'm just wondering if, in approaching this Cree character, I haven't been as confident in expressing her beliefs. And I just wonder what you would recommend in approaching that. And I feel like not including her voice as much. I'd like to include a balance. So sorry, this is totally, I'm rambling, but maybe if you, as writers, how would you approach this project? And including a balance in their voices, but also being sensitive and honoring their voices.
You're not rambling. I think that's a fairly legitimate question. Peter, can we start with you this time? What do you think?
I didn't catch all of the conversation. The sound is a bit odd there, but I would say that just again say, do your homework, understand the contexts, find the people who can give you information, make very sure that you do sensitivity reads on something like this. And again, check the protocols, find the community, make sure that you are there. I know you are writing out of the community into a different community where everyone is in a very odd community there at this summer camp situation. So just go to to the communities and do your homework.
Yeah, I'm so intrigued with these, like what happens with all these very different characters. So you've got me hooked there for sure. But yeah, I'm gonna just echo what Peter says, because if it was me writing this book, the first thing I'd be doing is going to that community and doing as much homework as I possibly can to make sure.
Can I just say, here's maybe a good place to come in, is we need to be careful here in terms of when we talk about diversity, not to associate diversity exclusively with race.
Very well said.
All right. I've heard this a few times here where we use that as a substitute for people of color. So and it wasn't this one, it's a segue into that, is because you are talking about several other forms of diversity in this story as well, from what I caught. For instance, the one practicing witchcraft, there's Wiccan. Make sure that you do your homework on Wicca as well, for instance. So when we talk diversity, yes, we're focusing on the Cree character because that's an Indigenous character and that's the issue right now. But you're also dealing with many other forms of diversity here.
Yeah, that's very
So-
well said. Very well said. Winnie?
Yeah, Peter, your brain and on my brain, just like that, absolutely. And utilizing and investing in your book in that. Okay, if you are writing about characters like the Wiccans, we're not comfortable with, and your sensitivity reader can only tell you so much, then hire a consultant, right? Not just talking to the community, but kind of having that legitimacy. I used two different consultants when I was writing a Boubacar story, because again, it was just wanting to pull it towards somewhere that's a little bit more authentic. It's okay to say, I don't know. I need to bring someone who does know.
Wow, that's beautifully said.
And
All right.
when
Go
you
ahead.
ask those people, keep a note of their names and keep a specific record of what they are helping you with, and acknowledge their contributions.
Yeah, really well said. We are approaching the 7:30 mark. I'd really like to be able to answer Scott, Anna, and Cassandra before we close off. Just a reminder, this is being recorded and it will be uploaded to YouTube. So if you do need to leave at 7:30 or whatever 30 mark you're in time zones, if it's 9:30, please feel free to exit out. We will, like I said, be uploading. But if you are cool to stick around for a few more minutes to hear the questions, again, you're welcome. If you do need to leave, thank you very much for joining us. We appreciated your time and your thoughtfulness, and we hope you have a very, very good evening. So Scott, what is your question?
Yeah, so thanks very much. This has been fantastic. So I'll ask my question and then just give some background. So is there a time when it's okay to have a character that falls into a stereotype or trope? And so I write middle grade in YA, and when I first started writing, it was very white. And so I was told to add in some diversity. And I married into a family of like East Asian Chinese background and live in Vancouver. So I have a friend of this main character who is, I don't outright say it, but her name's Kaylee. She swears in Mandarin every so often. They have dumplings, but she's also studious. And so when I saw your PDF about stereotypes and it said the studious Asian child, my heart, my stomach, everything dropped. And so the fact of her, like the character, having a character within that story being studious is important because that character helps to solve, provide a solution. Now, did I need to have that character be of presumed Asian background? Well, probably not. Anyway, so that's kind of where I am, and yeah, interested to hear your thoughts.
So the question is it okay to have the studious Asian kid, even though that's a stereotype, because there's other parts of her as well?
Yeah, there are.
She's not just centric. She's not like a one note character.
No, she and the main character, her and another, it's like a trio that go through. They're like three best friends going through, and they're all contributing to support the main character. And
yeah. That's an interesting, because like part of me is like, I think I'd have to read that to figure out if she was being stereotyped or not.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm curious. Winnie, what do you think?
And Natasha, you said it exactly right. That's not the only thing that defines her.
Mhm.
I am Asian, I am studious, but I'm also sometimes lazy. And like there's truth to the whole studious thing about Asian students and lots of other different kinds of students. And that's okay as long as it's not like the one kind of thing that you hit on over and over again, and it's just a recurring joke, and it's only there to serve that one little sake, if she has depth to your character has depth to her and she's more than that, that's okay because there's truth to that.
Yes. Yeah, it's really
And your
well, that's really well said.
Your sensitivity, like our sensitivity to are we using stereotypes? That's what's important here, not canceling ourselves over every little thing that we might be a mistake, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and it's not necessarily to do it with diversity or own voices per se, or like lived experience, but as a person who is in kids literature, sometimes I'll get notes back on word choice, and it is so obvious that it's an adult now making this word, wanting this word change, because no kid is ever going to speak like that. And then there needs to be a discussion usually between me and my editor, where I go, I don't know any child that's ever going to use that word. It's something that a kid would say, and for me to change it because we are potentially worried about how it might be perceived. And I write clean teen, so it's not like my word choices are ever going to be super controversial. But now what I'm looking at is I'm going to alienate my reader. So, and sort of like bang on the bell going, I'm an adult writing a kid, I'm an adult. And you don't ever want author intrusion that way. So it's tricky. Peter, what do you think?
I think what has been said it covers it, and that is make sure that your characters are complete, that they are nuanced, and that whatever stereotype trope you're using is just part of a rounder, fuller character, and that you don't keep harping on that same stereotype over and over to make that the dominant feature.
Yeah, thank you. That's really well said. Anna, sorry, is it good? Thanks, Scott. Yeah, I saw the thumbs up. I appreciate that. Anna.
Sorry, I couldn't find my unmute button.
No,
okay. I'm going to read my question. I know that's a little weird, but I don't want to take up all your time, and I just wanted to get it out of my head properly. And I don't even know if this makes sense. So thank you. Bear with me.
No worries.
Okay. I'm writing a historical novel based on a real person who had interactions with some major historical people during the Northwest Rebellion in 1885. So she's a real person who had interactions with Louis Riel and several of the chiefs and people like Edgar Dewey and the Prime Minister. But I'm trying to not have all these men overshadow her life story. So I'm trying to keep it to her perspective. And she had contact, but not like extensive daily contact, right? My concern is that if I don't give these diverse and interesting and men a lot of time in my book, if people will think that I'm not, I suppose whitewashing is not the right word, but that I'm silencing them or not giving them enough attention. I'm just, there's so much that you can write about them. Like there's so much, I've done so much research and I'm like, but it's just, I want to make this her story, and I'm struggling with like creating a realistic moment in time in her life without people feeling like I'm silencing these other groups.
But it's her story. So by default, the other groups are going to be on a lower volume anyway, right?
Yeah.
So I guess the question is, are you trying to serve your reader, in which case the priority is her story, or are you trying to service the people who will potentially judge you? And do you know, like that's what I feel like, and I might be completely wrong on this, but that's where I feel it's like I really want to write her story, but I've done all this research and now I'm wondering about like if someone's gonna come at me and the truth is, like, It doesn't matter how great your story is. There's always going to be someone who thinks you could have done better and you should have done this and you should have done that. And my favorite pastime is to go on Amazon and read the 1-star reviews of books that I super love, because it just reminds me how subjective the industry is. Well, yeah, right. Because you're like, how could you give it a 1? And then, yes. Anyway,
Yeah.
but so yeah, that's my thought on it. Winnie, Peter, what do you think?
When you were saying that, I just kept on saying, no, don't. You're passionate about this girl's story, so tell the story. And again, we're in this reactive culture where we are maybe self-filtering and maybe self-editing a little bit too much and canceling ourselves. And you're canceling the stories that you are passionate about telling, so tell it. And later on, when a publisher picks up your book and says, we need to change this, maybe we need to polish up this, then do that. But I don't think we should filter ourselves so much to the point that we're not being true to the stories that we want to tell.
Yeah.
Sensitivity is important, but we can't keep on just self-canceling.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Really
Peter?
helpful. Yeah, thank you.
I'm going to paraphrase and pull off from something that Lawrence Hill once said to me at a workshop. And that is that we were speaking in a group and somebody asked him, I have 3 stories. Which one do I write right now? And he looked and he said, if you die tomorrow, which of these stories does the world absolutely have to hear?
Oh, interesting.
That's the story you write.
Oh my God.
And-
Okay. Wow. Thank you. That's amazing.
All right. So if her story is the one that needs to be told, that's the story you write. Now, you can come back to the others. You can write those stories. You can write them from different vantage points. But which one do you need to tell now? Which one does the world need to hear?
Beautifully said. Thank you, Peter. Cassandra, we shall finish off the evening with you. Thank you, Anna. Thank you for that great question. Thank you all for the great questions, actually.
Mine is hopefully going to be quick and easy, but thank you so much for this panel. It's been lovely. I was wondering, at what point do you bring in sensitivity readers? I'm about 5 drafts in, and I know that I would like to get a sensitivity reader in at some point, but I don't know at what point I should be looking to get somebody else in who is focused on the area of diversity that I am including within my story.
Mine would be when I feel like I'm ready to send out to a publisher before I do that, because that to me signals that my story is as polished as I think it is. And then that way, when my sensitivity reader comes in, they're reading as clean of a manuscript as they possibly can. And they're not going to be wading through like extraneous stuff. And then I would take their notes and then polish it up and then send it off. But Winnie, Peter, what do you think? When is a good time? Beginning, middle, end? I'm saying end.
I would say for a sensitivity read of the whole document, yes, as close to the final as you can, but I don't think you should dismiss the opportunity to bring somebody in as a consultant during development.
Yeah.
Okay. There may be an aspect that you are worried about, a certain passage or paragraph, to go to somebody and to consult about those aspects. So yes, a full sensitivity read at the end, but if there are aspects that you can identify where you're already a little worried, find a consultant.
Well said. Well said. Winnie, what do you think? I see you nodding. Yeah. Okay.
In fact, Winnie, that's what you did a lot with your story, didn't you? Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, friends, that's great that we didn't go too much over time. Before I say the good nights, Winnie, you cannot have a fur face and not bring them up to the camera. What is going on there? Who is that?
She was like barking, so I had to mute
Because they wait till you're trying to be a grown up.
She is my writing partner in crime. She keeps me warm as I write. And this is Zoe, my little black pug. So there she is. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, listen, I don't know a better way to end off this really gorgeous night other than with the face of Zoe. Friends, thank you from Peter and I and Winnie and I and David and the Edmonton Arts Council and the Writers Guild who sorted this all for us. Thank you so much for joining us. We hope we have been of service and gave you some things to think about. David, I think, is going to be resending the PDF for those who didn't receive it. It's got a ton of questions, things for you to consider before you're writing, while you're writing, after you're writing. And again, this will be uploaded if you want to rewatch to sort of refresh yourself on what was said and some of the points. So thank you very much. Have a beautiful night and happy writing. May the pages go smoothly, friends. Good night.
Good night, everyone.
So
Thank you, everyone.
okay, good night.